a woman who had sex without having a husband, who got pregnant without having a husband, and most unthinkable of all, had a baby without having a husband, um, was in opposition to this idea of the building of the sacral white family. In the 1940s, on some gray November day, let's say, um, Freudian theory begins to shape US social policy, many institutional orientations, the service delivery, the people who work in these places. Everyone was thinking in Freudian terms. And they were sometimes crude adaptations of Freudian terms, but nevertheless, that's what they were. And the idea was that women, read that white women, who had sex, pregnancy, and children without having a husband were psychologically damaged. They were nuts. They were doing something that was such a violation of white girl norms that they had to be crazy. And this theory was, first of all, an enormous change from saying that a white girl who had these experiences was of low intelligence and it came from alcoholic parents, and that her flaw was in her biology. This changed the site of the problem from the body to her mind, which had enormous consequences for the quality, the imagined quality of the baby, because the baby was no longer the product of a flawed biology. It was simply the product of a flawed mind, but a mind would not invade the perfect baby. So the baby could emerge from her body as a commodity on the newly constructed white adoption market. This was absolutely a crucial feature animating the development of the adoption market. As long as you have babies being born who are not fine commodities, no one would bother to build the market. But as soon as the babies could be defined as valuable and desirable, what would that give rise to but a market for them? So that's what we see in the post-war era. We see the flourishing among white social service agencies, government policies, and so on in the 1940s, 50s, 60s. And then something dramatic happens in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and that is abortion becomes legal, first in a handful of states and then federally through the Supreme Court decision, Roe v. Wade in 1973. You see a collapse of the domestic adoption marketplace. Women said to themselves, girls and women said to themselves repeatedly in these years, good Lord, if I can decide whether or not to stay pregnant, surely I can decide whether or not to be the mother of the baby who I'm deciding to give birth to. If the state has given me the right to control my own body by saying that I can decide to get an abortion, okay, the most logical next step is the state is not going to interfere with my right to keep this baby if I so choose. So what you see several unintended but very marked results. You see white women all over the country shocking their families, shocking their communities by saying, I'm going to keep this baby. You see adoption agencies going crazy all over the country because there are no more white babies. You see the rise of the adoption by white families of babies of color, often under the flag of I'm doing my part for civil rights, which is a very complex claim. And finally, you see the development of connections between American adoption agencies and entities that manage the separation of mothers and babies in the poorest countries on earth, among the most resourceless women in those countries. And understanding international adoption was really key for me to formulate the position that adoption is an index, a marker of who are the most resourceless women on earth and in this country. It is a feature of the prevalence of resourceless women and girls somewhere. That there is no adoption without economic violence, social class violence, racial violence, or gender violence against women. Because I'm not a essentialist. I don't believe that every woman wants the baby that she has, and that every woman who gives up her baby is it is an act of violence against her. I don't believe in that kind of essentialism. But what I do notice is that where adoption occurs, we see resourceless women over and over and over again. And my studies of adoption in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, there is no question but that the white women who were pressed to give their babies away had nothing that we would now call choice, that they were daughters in families where they were the most powerless people in the family, and which is to say that boy children had significant more status and power in families, and that they were treated that way, and that their sexuality and reproductive capacity was considered a family asset and not theirs. So I've learned a lot over these years since I first began to think about these matters, and I feel pretty confident that adoption and resourceless women go hand in hand. In the post-war period, as public policies responded to mothers in poverty, only white women who became eligible for Social Security benefits, many did. They were not forced to work as Black women were often. Motherhood among women of color began to be defined as a crime. Poverty was defined as a crime in many ways, through law, through policy, through social attitudes. Motherhood became a signal crime. Sex itself was discussed by policymakers and politicians as a class privilege. We know, for example, that welfare departments in every city and town in the United States developed policies where where African-American women in particular who received welfare benefits were subjected to midnight visits by welfare department officials to see if there was a man in the house. And if there was a man in the house, that woman would be removed from benefits. It was inconsistent, according to welfare policy, for a woman to both be receiving benefits and to be having sex, much less to be getting pregnant and having a baby. And there were separate punishments for those things. For example, getting kicked out of public housing, or I mean, the list went on and on of the kinds of punishments that public policy mandated social agencies deliver to women who committed the crime of having sex, getting pregnant, and becoming a mother during, let's say, the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, for 50 years and more. On the other hand, white women who had babies when they were poor were not so much committing a crime as violating this newly emergent idea that motherhood was a class privilege. This emerged in such a vibrant form during the turn against welfare provision, ending welfare as we know it. And that welfare provision was not only targeting people who weren't white, who were having children who politicians and policymakers didn't want to see as citizens. It was for everybody. So if you were a white woman and you were poor and you got pregnant without having a husband and not having enough money, you were committing a crime against middle-class norms. I always ask the question, how much money is enough money to have a child? And who gets to decide that? What it costs to have a child depends on so many things, which have a lot to do with culture and circumstances and access to resources. And people don't usually calculate their capacity to love and parent only on how much money they have. And yet we were living in a society which said if you were poor, you should not reproduce.